So now it's part of its 25 years activations. The South African National Editors Forum, SANEF, has literally a few minutes ago concluded their Ethics and Credibility Conference towards building ethical and credible South African media. The conference is a culmination of events since SANEF commissioned the Satchwell and fellow panelist report that looked into the subject. Also, the organization released a report during the week titled Media Sustainability and Universal Access to Public Interest Journalist Strategies and Considerations. Sbu Ngalwa is the chair of SANEF. Sbu, we don't get many opportunities to speak to you, so we're going to try and cram everything in. I hope you'll indulge us. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, sorry, Desiree. I think my signal is not that great. I may have missed the question, but I'm sure it relates to the media ethics and credibility conference
Sbu,
that we.
Sbu, I had not asked you a question yet. I was still introducing the conversation. But it must have been an interesting...
My apologies.
Yeah, but it must have been an interesting session. We're already seeing reports of delivery by one of your speakers, Business Day editor Songezo Zibi, reminding journalists that, quote, they are Mr. Magashule and Mr. Malema and not SG or CIC, and also saying politics pose a threat to media freedom. What were some of the highlights at this just-ended meeting?
I think you've captured it correctly, Desiree, in that Songezo was one of our headline speakers, and his speech seems to have resonated very well with the participants. But also we had Alan Rusbridger, who is the former editor of The Guardian in the UK, and last we also had Judge Bernard Ngwebe also speaking candidly. Remember, Judge Ngwebe is the chair of the appeals panel of the Press Council of South Africa, talking about his own insights into the behavior of journalists. As you would know, that the main reason why we had this conference, it is a follow-up to that report that was published in January by Judge Satchwell. That independent report looked at some of the ethical flaws in our industry over the past few years. Obviously, some of those included those famous stories of the Sunday Times, the stories of between 2011 and 2016 that were eventually withdrawn by the newspaper. But the conference was not about the Sunday Times or its ethical flaws, but looking at the entire industry, because there were, you would also remember, or some of the viewers may recall, that there were 69 recommendations that came out of the Satchwell report. So what we needed to do was to break it down in such a way that we make sure that we not only theme the recommendations, but also are able to make sure that almost all the areas are covered. Now, today's conference was preceded, Desiree, by at least 4 webinars that looked at some of those themes. So today is a culmination of that, but also more importantly, to develop a action plan that we will roll out over the next 5 years as SANEF championing that.
As you say, you're looking at multiple issues, but just last week we marked International World Press Freedom Day with the theme Information as a Public Good. How did this event speak about access? You're already speaking about access, with most media vendors already seeking to monetize their content by putting up paywalls. What contradictions exist here, and were you able to find solutions?
Look, it may seem like a contradiction, Desiree, but I'm sure you and I agree that journalism costs money. It costs money to produce journalism. So most of the companies that are in the media space are also for-profit companies that rely on either advertising revenue or subscriptions to be able to continue that they are doing. So I think for us, there's no discord between end users paying for journalism. But what we are asking for, actually, part of the things that we're asking for is as part of the report that you spoke about on the sustainability of the media, is that we are asking for a number of interventions, including the zero rating of news sites. Because you would know, Desiree, that as a South African, you have to pay twice. One, you pay for your data, which is exorbitant, which is very expensive in this country. And then secondly, news sites expect you to be paying to access the news. So in calling for universal access and also zero rating of credible news sites, we are saying that this will give an opportunity to new entrants who would not necessarily be using the same funding model that some of the companies that rely on subscriptions use. I mean, we know that there are publications that rely on donor funding, but also contributions from their viewers or their consumers. So in opening up the space, that then creates opportunities for new entrants to be able to come into the fold and to be able to, at the very least, make sure that communities and South Africans in general, because almost every South African has a smartphone, that they can at least be able to access the news, because news, in as much as there are sites that are selling subscription, access to information is a basic right. And as SANEF, we see it important for us to be in the forefront of that, to make sure that as part of our contribution to the democratic project, that the news and access to the news and dissemination of information continues, and also communities in their various localities and in the languages that they speak, that they're able to access the news and be part and participate in the broadening of our democracy.
So on the one hand, you're talking about sustainability, and on the other, you're talking about credibility. These of themselves are very two big conversations. How are you balancing them out? Quite a lot to go through, I imagine.
Look, the issue of credibility obviously is what brought us to this point, which is why we had to have a media ethics conference, because ethics, the ethical lapses that we've seen over the past few years are what brought us to this point. Because given the pressures that we've faced in terms of reduced advertising revenue and also reduced print circulation for the traditional media, we also have seen a development of a trust deficit between ourselves as the media and our consumers. And I'm sure, Desiree, you know people who say, I only get my news on Twitter as opposed to mainstream media. And that is a worrying thing, because Twitter, of course, allows for everyone to have a voice, but not everyone can be a journalist. So you still need credible news sources to filter through, particularly disinformation and what the people call fake news and misinformation campaigns. So there needs to be some discernment and some deliberate demarcation of what are your credible news sites. Now, talking about sustainability, now, one of the things that we're saying is that we know over the past year, in fact, we did a dipstick survey between March and June of 2020, where we looked at the impact of COVID-19. And we were clear at that time that COVID-19 had decimated the industry. We lost no less than 700 jobs during those few months. And I'm sure by now, Desiree, including all the retrenchments, including SABC and other major companies, there are well over 1,000 journalists that have lost their jobs. But at the same time, the need for audiences to get credible news is even greater, because as an organization, SABC between March and June saw an increase of between 40 and 60% for their isiZulu and isiXhosa news bulletins. Now, this was at the height just after the outbreak of COVID-19. But at the same time, news sites saw a similar uptick where their traffic grew by anything between 40 and 70%. What does that tell us? It tells us that while COVID-19 may have decimated the industry, at the same time, the need for credible information is even greater. And now we are under pressure because we're doing more with less. We have less journalists, as I mentioned earlier, but the need for us to produce journalism of a higher standard, not just a higher content standard, but higher ethical standard, is even greater. That is why SANEF is leading these efforts to say, in talking about media sustainability, let us start with the establishment of a media sustainability fund, which will support the development of the sustainability and independence of a public interest media, and also a fund which we can use to drive ethical practices as we pursue the right to freedom of expression and other democratic principles. But more importantly, there are a number of suggestions as well, Desiree, that have been put on the table, and some of those include tax reliefs, subsidies, and also looking at other income generating models for the media. This is not an exhaustive conversation, but today's conference was an important one. In fact, we had a very good turnout of over 100 participants drawn from all walks of life, from civil society, from business, media organizations, media owners, just coming together in a virtual room, I must add, to say, what do we do to take forward the media, but also what do we do to make sure that some of the ethical lapses we have seen, because it's not that just because we had a report from the Satchwell Commission that suddenly some of the transgressions by the media stop. They haven't stopped. We saw recently the Sunday World firing a journalist for trying to solicit a bribe. That is the kind of conduct that actually sullies our name as journalists and also as the media. So that's why it is important to bring everyone on board. It's not about SANEF, it's not for SANEF, but SANEF is just the vehicle, or rather the coordinator of these efforts to make sure that we have a strong and credible media beyond this process, or this period rather, Desiree.
As you say, the fund is only but one of the suggested strategies, and would like to encourage it's mostly journalists or our viewers to go through to the SANEF website to look at a list. It's quite an exhaustive one of the other suggested strategies in this regard. I know this conference was dealing with strategic issues, but just on the operational side, in a week such as this one, when the world is once again visited upon by the multidimensional story of the counterattacks between Israel and Palestine, what did the meeting discuss about the dynamics of covering this particular story?
Although we did not go into that in detail, Desiree, but in terms of some of the comments that came through the chats, it was about how the media reflects and reports on certain communities. And there was a view that was expressed in one of the chats where it says that the media, for instance, has not been giving a true reflection of what is happening in the Middle East, particularly between Palestine and Israel. But when we were speaking about this, it was also about representation of certain communities. As you would know, that in a country like ours, which is majority poor, you have millions of people who live in rural communities who have no access to the media. And also, you will also recall that media companies, as part of their restructuring processes, they are actually pulling back from the regions, or what they call regions. So they lack of investment in those spaces. But what does that mean? So the discussion was around, what does that mean for the greater democratic project in terms of advancing democracy, and what role do we play as the media to make sure that we bridge that gap? And we did note that there is a new voices that are coming up. There are some small publications that are coming up in various areas, like for instance, in KwaZulu-Natal, I know of at least 2 online digital publications in isiZulu, one being impempe.com, which is a sports site, and also Umbele by Likanyile Media, which is a site which is a business site primarily in isiZulu. Now, those are the kind of efforts that we're saying as SANEF should be supported, because the development of African languages is important, and in making sure that the communities and the people of South Africa are able to have a media that not only speaks to them, but also speaks to them in their languages. And this is not about, trust me, Desiree, it's not about defending established media, but COVID-19 and the kind of destruction that we saw over this period, and the challenges that we see in the media currently, give us an opportunity to chart a new way forward. And that new way forward has to do with us deciding that we can do away with the old. Can you save print media? I believe you cannot. But what can you do? I think we can then be able to develop a media fund which will target local media and also support organizations that promote African languages. So you can come up with your startup, and if this media fund is as successful as we would like it to be, then you can be able to support that as part of journalism and also as part of the media contributing to the advancement of our democracy.
Sbu, are there any new learnings about the South African media landscape? Who are the owners of media? What's the new face of journalism? How is technology affecting media going forward in South Africa?
Look, without we didn't go into detail about media ownership, but except to say that technology, we should embrace technology, because the reality is that when I was making an example earlier about some of the research that we saw in terms of online audiences and the uptick that we saw also in TV viewing over that period, it tells you that in as much as there is a media industry or there is a section of the media that is declining, that is print or what you just referred to as the traditional media, there is still a hunger, for lack of a better word, for credible news sources. But what this scenario, the current setup does, Desiree, is that it gives an opportunity for a new kind of media to emerge. I think the future of the media, we all realize it now. It's no longer about the big three or big four. It's not about your Naspers, your Independent, your Arena Media, or your Kextins. It's actually about small media houses or small outfits in the various, either in urban centers like Gauteng and also in different localities who are able to communicate with those very communities and also to be able to connect with their communities. That is where we see the future of journalism. Yes, you'll still have the new companies. Obviously, they're trying to adapt new reality, but the reality is there's a bigger opportunity here to make sure that the media is active and it is vibrant in all the different localities. Now, let me make an example, Desiree. There was a time when I edited a newspaper in the Eastern Cape called the Daily Dispatch, which is the biggest regional newspaper in that part. When I spoke about a declining media industry, if you look at the regional papers, for instance, while COVID-19 has decimated print circulation by anything between 40 and 80% for some newspapers, if you look at what is happening in the regions, in areas like your Port Elizabeth and your East London, you will realize that actually while regional papers are declining, but it is at a reduced rate, in that while they are declining, they are moving at a normal rate that they were declining at. Or actually, they have not moved that much, because over the years, papers would decline anything between 10 and 12%. But if you look at the COVID-19 period, you see that those papers are declining by some closer margins, by anything up to 18%. So which tells you of the resilience and the greater need to invest in local journalism. So that underlines underlines what I believe is the future of journalism. Hence, I made the point earlier about the need to promote African languages, because there's a greater need. If you look at all the skits that we normally get on our WhatsApp, it's usually funny content generated by some guys in some rural area, and that actually tells you that there is an audience and there is a need for the content. But it's just a matter of making sure that beyond just the funny videos and the skits that we get sometimes on our WhatsApp and from the various areas, it actually tells you that there is a gap there that needs to be filled to provide credible journalism and journalism of a higher standard that can be able to service those communities.
So we have a variety of viewers watching today. Some are just your usual news consumers, but others are interested in creating content. What do we say to a viewer about why it's important to follow the activities of SANEF, especially this conference that was held today?
I think we would welcome anyone who wants to generate content, but I think the reality is that as journalists, it is important to be able to subscribe to all the ethical codes that we are all bound by. For instance, I think as a starting point, anyone wanting to register, let's say they're small media outfit, let's say be it a website or any other platform, that actually they register and become a member of the Press Council of South Africa. Why that is important is that with the membership of the Press Council of South Africa, one, it says that you are accountable as an outfit, in that if there are any ethical breaches, you can be hauled before the Press Council to the Press Ombudsman to either one, explain yourself, but where it is found that you have done wrong or you have transgressed, you can be able to remedy that, either through an apology or otherwise. But I think that's a starting point. But also subscribing to the press code, which most South African companies do have done, is important also, so that in terms of the ethical standards, we are all held to the same ethical standards. So anyone wanting to come into the fold, and why SANEF, the work that SANEF does becomes important, in that it's not just about issuing statements when journalists are attacked at rallies or at crime scenes, although that the issue of the safety of journalists is important for us. What is equally important for us is training that we do. For instance, now, as we are going to the local government elections, Tesri, they are rolling out training in the various provinces, and we will be working with the IEC to make sure that journalists are well equipped as we go to the local government elections. But also, more importantly, Desiree, you and I, and maybe some of our colleagues are from an era where we used to laugh off cases of trauma, where we'd experience traumatic experiences and just talk about it and forget about it. And I'm sure that goes for also the older journalists that were there perhaps during the violence in the 90s, who experienced a lot of trauma but never dealt with it. We live in a different time, and I think COVID-19 has brought into sharp focus the issue of mental health support, or the need for mental health support. And I can say that, I can tell you and the viewers today, that over the next few weeks, SANEF has partnered with the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, which is SADC, to actually customize, to generate, come up with a custom program that will help journalists, either through group therapy and also individual access to mental health professionals at free of charge. And also beyond that, we also do know that media houses and managers actually are not trained, do not even understand mental health issues. So it is important that as part of this partnership between ourselves and the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, we actually start with the training of media managers in what they would call mental health hygiene, just to understand those issues and sometimes not have to wait until things manifest when somebody has a breakdown, to make sure that we create an environment which is conducive to a productive work, but also does not drive journalists to that point. And I think that for us is one of the important projects that we're leading as a service to South African journalism. So in terms of the work that SANEF is doing, besides the report that we've done on media ethics and credibility, and the conference that we had today, those are some of the projects which we would encourage every journalist in this country to be part of, because that is for the benefit not of SANEF members, but for every journalist in this country.
Of course, there's a lot we could talk about, but time constraints don't allow. But just tell us about that call that SANEF is making for the ANC Womens League president, Bathabile Dlamini, to apologize for tweeting what seems to be intimidation of a female journalist, Conita Hunter.
Obviously, I'm sure you would have seen the story that was published by Kanita's employers, News 24, about a meeting of the ANC Womens League. And what followed after that, actually the story, as I understand it, had to do with the Women's League taking a different direction to what the president of the Women's League would have liked, where they actually eventually issued a statement saying that as the Women's League, they will not get involved in the politics or the battles of men. They are about women issues. So that story did not please the president of the Women's League, who went on to Twitter to attack Kanita. And I think beyond that, what normally happens is that with politicians, because they draw a large following and they have a number of supporters, once they start to lead those attacks, what follows is a barrage of abuse and cyberbullying directed at journalists. And in this instance, it was Kanita who was called all sorts of names. Now, for us as SANEF, we believe that it is actually quite disturbing for a senior leader of Batabile Dlamini's caliber to be leading that charge and those attacks, because we know in this country that the media in this country is accountable to the Press Council and also to the Press Ombudsman. And the president of the ANC Women's League knows those channels. And if a story was wrong, if she had a problem with that story, she knows what those channels are available. And in fact, now the Press Ombudsman's office has been revamped to have 2 deputies, so that the work of the Press Ombudsman is dispensed with without much delay. So it's not even a matter of delays or her not being able to get justice when she needs it. I'm sure that complaint would have been heard and decided upon in no time. But I think what we are against and what we are discouraging is the use of social media to attack journalists, because that opens them up to cases of cyberbullying, and which actually is one of the reasons and one of the issues that have led us to, as SANEF, to champion this campaign for mental health support for journalists, because the level of abuse that you see on social media platforms is almost unspeakable. I mean, I'm sure as a journalist you probably would know that as well. So that's what SANEF's statement was about, condemning the action of Batabile Dlamini and asking for political leaders and also the Women's League to refrain from doing that.
On that note, thank you very much for your time today. Sbu Ngalwa is the chair of the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF. They've just concluded a conference on ethics and sustainability.